Now it is my pleasure to thank you all for coming, and my pleasure to welcome our MC for today's digital update, Kevin Ormsby. Kevin works as a dance teacher, a choreographer, a movement coach, and an arts marketing consultant. He's artistic director at Kasha Dance and a current board member of Toronto Alliance for the Performing Arts. So thanks again for you being here, Kevin. Let's begin.
Thanks for the invitation, Claire. I want to start with the land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge the sacred land where we work, create, and find breath. This land has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years and is the land on which I have danced, administer, and support the arts. This land is the traditional territory Takaranto, where the trees meet the water, the gathering place of many nations, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We're grateful and thankful to have the opportunity to live, work, and play on this land. In extension, I want to call into focus and honor the indigenous lands of the Americas and the Caribbean, in particular the Tainos of the land that nurtured my being, on which I arrived at birth, Jamaica, the land of wood and water, known as Jamaica. As we acknowledge systems of oppression on this land, and in particular anti-Black racism, I am mindful of the indigenous teachings and philosophies like the wampum belt and the dish with one spoon, aimed at bringing us through diverse understandings into a shared collective presence and opportunity.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So welcome everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. I am Claire Hopkinson. I'm the Director and CEO of the Toronto Arts Council and the Toronto Arts Foundation. And we are doing these digital updates so we can help the arts community understand what is going on and take steps to possible reopening in time. I'd like to thank David Kalenda again, who is providing ASL interpretation. So anyone needing ASL can pin David's video block that's the largest on their screen. So you need the speaker view selected in the top right-hand corner to do this.
I'm Pat Tobin. I'm the Director of Arts and Cultural Services for the City of Toronto. Along with me is Jacoba Kapanen from Toronto Alliance of the Performing Arts. You've met Kevin, you've met David Kalenda. Kris Gibbs with Ryerson University will be here to talk about research that he and the team are leading in the safe reopening of cultural venues to include festivals and performing arts venues. And David Absalom, who you see in his apartment, I think, is a Toronto Urban Fellow who signed up to work with the city as a graduate student pursuing his PhD, thinking he was going to be working on Indigenous placemaking for a few months. And David, as soon as we found out he had a master's in public health, he's ended up doing excellent work here. So you'll hear a lot from David today. Also with us is Tara Galora, who is with Toronto Public Health and is the resource person that Toronto Public Health has identified to work with economic development and culture, both on the business side as well as on the cultural side. And she's been excellent. You'll hear a bit from Tara later. Also, we've got two colleagues who are joining us from the Cultural Policy Branch of the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport for Ontario. That's Deborah Larry and John Parsons. And they will be able to chime in when we get into the Q&A portion to provide some information from the province. And I'm going to check with Rachel Kennedy, our great stage manager, to see if Claire is able to dial back in, or if you'd like us to proceed, Rachel.
I think let's go ahead. We've got Jacoba speaking first. So Jacoba, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everybody, and thanks so much to the City of Toronto and Pat Tobin and his team for working so closely together with the Toronto Arts Council and together with Tapa, the Toronto Alliance for the Performing Arts. As many of you know who are on the chat and on the call today, we represent 164 professional theatre and dance and opera companies here in the city of Toronto. And we are hearing back from all of you and have been consistently hearing questions that we understand we won't be able to answer all of those questions today. We are figuring things out as we go along. Things are developing and unfolding really rapidly. But I do want to say that one of the consistent things that we hear from everyone is confusion and a lack of clarity around what to do and how to reopen. So Tapa is working on collecting information from across the country, as well as nationally, internationally, I should say, and we are aiming to share that with our membership and with the city, and as well as with Kris Gibbs in July, we hope, so that we can develop a kind of a playbook and a kind of a guide that will certainly be a fluid document to help guide us through this. I also want to share with you all that our very first survey that we put out a week into the COVID-19 pandemic at the beginning of March focused on the financial impact at that time, with all the venues closing on March the 17th. It focused on what that meant to all of you who were postponing indefinitely or canceling productions on Toronto stages. The impact financially was revealed to us here in the city of Toronto alone at being $500 million. The next survey that will be coming to you from Tapa is shifting our focus from the financial impact to the artistic impact and what that means to you in terms of the upcoming 2021 season. We're hearing anecdotally that the majority of you will not open before March 21 to September 21. So we're going to gather that information from all of you to understand what that means opening in waves of workshops, readings, rehearsals, performances, and so on. So thank you for taking the time to be here. I know that there's high degree levels of Zoom exhaustion, and we so appreciate you being with us today. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. Pat Tobin speaking again. Just before I roll into an introduction of the next content, just wanted to check with Claire, who got abruptly truncated in her remarks. So just want to throw back.
No, I'm fine. So I'm sorry about that. It happens sometimes, always at the wrong moment. Again, it was just a welcome. Thank you for introducing everyone, Pat. Back over to you.
Good. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Jacoba. And thank you all, principally Tapa's membership, who are signed up for the call today. We were able to join Tapa at a previous town hall very early in the pandemic. It feels like 1983 at this point. And at that point, we talked, as Jacoba just laid out, about the $500 million loss. We talked a lot about liquidity at that time, both for organizations and individuals. There was a lot of conversation around the fate of vulnerable workers in the creative sector. And Claire and team were just getting off the board with city participation, the Rapid Relief Fund for Artists. Through that, we also talked about digital transition. And then we talked a bit about the work the city was doing, festivals, live music venues, with some support to try to help people manage through. But we also noted at that point, early as it was, that clearly this being new terrain for all of us, an important role for economic development and culture at the city would be to try to help people navigate what was not even yet known to us as the cascading public policy around public health promotion and protection to manage the pandemic, get it under control, and then a phased reopening such as we're experiencing today, with phase 2 reopening for Toronto. It's becoming an increasing focus of our work, and I've identified David Absalom, we're so lucky to have aboard, as we had no public health experts at EDC. I think it's something we're going to keep for the future. So today's purpose is, as Jacoba says, trying to bring some measure of clarity to what is frankly a very confusing situation. You will have lots of questions. We will have answers to some, hopefully most. We will not have answers to all. Where we don't have answers today, we'll take your questions away and we'll come back to you. As I mentioned, in addition to David and Kris Gibbs, we have experts from Toronto Public Health. Tara Galaro is here, as well as our colleagues, Deborah Lowry and John Parsons from the province. So between us all, hopefully we can get you some good answers. I think our main objectives are to outline how the system works, because there is a lot of confusion about what policy applies to what area at what time, and who is responsible for enforcing it. So we'll try to pull that apart and talk to you about how it works. We'll talk to you about how we can support, the we being EDC, the Toronto Arts Council, what role we can play. We're not a regulator. We're not doing the compliance function. Our role is to jump in and like conversations like this, try to help you figure out what information you need and get it to you in a timely and clear and consistent manner. And again, we'll take your questions here and after. The main messages we're going to deliver today really are four. And one, it's that the policy that people need to understand and monitor emanates from the province and the state of emergency declaration and the subsequent emergency orders, the framework that the province has issued on reopening, and then the sector level guidance that the province provides. So as responsibility for health falls to the province, they are the ones who principally set the policy and then the timing around reopening. The second part is that it's on proponents, be they small businesses extending a cafe at a restaurant or a performing arts venue, to understand the policy as much as possible and to make plans that adhere as closely as possible to the policy. The city role is principally in monitoring and compliance. So I'm going to explain that a little bit more, but it falls to local public health units, such as the City of Toronto, to enforce the provincial policies. What that means is bylaw officers, in the case of patios, will go out and ensure that they're consistent with standing public health policy, but as well as anything that's been issued specific to COVID-19. So I need to underline that two things when it comes to individual organizations. The onus does reside at the level of the organization to figure out the policy and apply it. And secondly, there is not a specific office of pandemic reopening. So there is no one place to go with a business plan to have someone stamp it as okay to go. And if that is frustrating, it is frustrating for a lot of organizations. There's an immersive digital media exhibition opening very, very soon, and they've been breaking ground on this, but it's been quite frustrating for Starbucks. I think I can speak for them to navigate this system. That's sort of the black and white on how it functioned. Today's call is our commitment to you to try to take some of the friction out of that system, to try to get you the information that you need and the time that you need it, knowing that we don't control ultimate sign-off or compliance. But we're going to, for ED&C, we're going to continue to advocate to Toronto Public Health about what the sector's needs are, so that as guidance gets issued for specific things like performing arts venues, it reflects what your operational reality is. And then secondly, we're going to work between you and Toronto Public Health to communicate back their guidance as quickly as possible and interpret it for you. We'll get into some additional support that we might be able to do later in the call when we get into Q&As, such as your access to PPE and other technology that will allow for safe reopening, support the confidence of of arts patrons to return. And we could talk about that a bit more. But it was those main 4 messages I want to repeat. Provincial guidance important to understand. Onus ultimately rests on the individual business or enterprise. The city's primary role is in monitoring compliance. But 4th point, and why we're here on this call, EDC is going to work with you to the full extent possible to try to make this system knowable, understandable, functional for you. So those are my main messages. And at that, I'll pass it over to Kris Gibbs from Ryerson University.
Thanks, Pat. In typical professorial fashion, I've prepared some slides to follow along today. So if you're looking to take online classes, Ryerson's open in September with online courses. Actually, I'm teaching a concert and festival management course this summer, starting in 2 weeks. So anyway, excited about the new delivery. Anyway, here to just chat with you quickly about Lights On. Lights On is recovery and reboot in live entertainment. Is a series of outreach activities that the School of Creative Industries at Ryerson University, the Toronto Arts Council, and the Toronto Arts Foundation have embarked on. And it's with a couple of colleagues, Louis Etienne Dubois, who runs a research institute called Foley, Future of Live Entertainment, and Sean Newman, the research director at the Toronto Arts Council. We came together, and we've also got the support of an amazing roster of organizations, including the City of Toronto, Mass Culture, SOCAN, Canada's Actors Equity, and Tapa, and our own group. The idea is to bring together leaders and experts in health and arts organizations to start to support the live entertainment sector in its recovery and rebuild. We just sort of give you a timeline. We haven't, we sort of came across this idea to do this back in April. Actually, it was March 29th when we published an article about sort of the lights going out in this business, and it was the first time of it going out. And we do a lot of work with Cirque du Soleil, and Cirque had, you know, around that time closed 34 shows across the world, and they normally sell 15 million tickets a year. So, and we're still doing work with them to work through this process for them. And what we've done is we've early in May, we put together a grant application to get some funding from the federal government for some research dollars from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Our first sort of project in June is really to focus on venues. So a lot is the group that we're here today with, a lot of you are venues, to start to identify strategies for recovery and reopening. And we hope to know whether we've got some federal funding in July. In the meantime, the City of Toronto has provided us some funding to hire some graduate students and others to help us start to do workshops and start to produce artifacts or things that will help you as businesses in this sector. And you'll start to see stuff from us in hopefully the August to November time period. I know it doesn't answer maybe immediate questions now, but hopefully it can help some things later. We've kind of broken our collaboration into 5 sectors. Each sector is sponsored by a different organization, whether it's TO Live or Mass Culture or Toronto Alliance for the Performing Arts or Canadian Actors Equities. So we'll be working with these different organizations and communicating back in sort of these sectors and things like that. So when we are thinking of it, it's just not about opening the doors of the venues, it's about everything from the digital music that's produced and everything in between. Initial stuff that we've done right now, and I'll just report some sort of initial findings on that. We literally, I have a student that's been working for almost 3 weeks now. All she does is follow the internet, follow what's going on beyond Toronto, what's going on globally, and trying to understand the impacts and recommendations and challenges and inspirations that are related to specifically just live entertainment. And, you know, it's an unpredictable, we're at a very unpredictable stage in this pandemic, but we feel that we can learn best from others, and we're trying to systematically scan the internet. So some things that some patterns that we've noticed already, and some things that you're probably feeling already. You know, there are lots of good guides. While the city does not have one, or the province of Ontario doesn't have one, if your organization's sitting there going, how do I open a venue safely? There are multiple different guides out there for you. We will hopefully be working with Tapa and others to maybe Ontario-ize it or live theaterize it specifically for our market. We think that that's a need that we've just uncovered working with our different partners. The public health guidelines, it is confusing, especially since every province has their own guidelines. They all have different rules and different guidelines. You will probably need to become an expert in it. Like Pat said, and even one of the requirements of businesses is they're going to publish them. Nobody's going to tell them going to approve you, but they're going to expect you to follow them. So that's that. A lot of stuff about initial social distancing with different sports venues, and you're seeing it in the States a lot. That if you want to follow the 2-meter rule, you're probably going to get about 20% capacity. But for most of you, it's going to be challenging to break even until it gets to closer to 50%. The one thing is innovations and operating guidelines are a lot of it's going to come from outside entertainment. So there's a ton of businesses that are opening today or have been opening, or namely hospitals as an example. If you're starting to say, I need to screen employees to come into the backstage, things like that, well, hospitals screen employees every day. And University Health Network has an amazing app they've developed. So a lot of our innovations are going to come from outside. I would encourage you to tabletop or look at different contingencies. We don't know. I mean, Jacoba talked about March to September 21. There's going to be different scenarios. Your organization should be looking at different 2 or 3 different scenarios of opening times to manage your cash flow and manage your business. So where are we today in our project? We're at 0% capacity. Venues aren't open. When they open, you're probably going to, under the 2-meter ruling, you're going to have probably a 20 to 30% capacity if you wanted to be open in a seated format. I don't know how or when we can get to something that's closer to 50% where you can make money. We don't know that. No answers to that. But ultimately, over this period, we want to get to the stage where it's 100% capacity. I have some sort of inspiring stories to watch and listen. And the first one is, if you haven't read about the Phantom of the Opera in Seoul, the Phantom of the Opera is open, never closed, been open the whole time through. As Pat had talked about, the Van Gogh exhibit and the guys at Starbucks Entertainment and Corey, they're opening. They're fighting through it. They're figuring it out. So just follow them. They're good to learn from, and they're kind of a leader in our space. One that's just got announced, look to pivot. I think a lot of businesses need to look to pivot. And, you've got the Cabana Pool Bar, which is normally a live venue a live music concert venue, plus a patio bar with pools, is now shifting to all patio and redoing their business. So watch what Inc. Entertainment's doing with that. And look at ways that potentially you can use your outdoor spaces. And then in Germany, there's the Berliner Ensemble. They're doing lots of interesting stuff with opening. So in closing, be ready to pivot. Look for things like revenge shopping. When things do reopen, we saw this in China. I see people smiling. It is a phenomenon. We call it revenge shopping. When the malls open, in Toronto, I think it's this weekend maybe, or next weekend, the sales will be up. There will be a revenge. So expect revenge entertainment when you do eventually get to open. There will be benefits to those that are first movers. So very similar to the Van Gogh exhibit as a first mover, they're getting lots of great media attention that you couldn't buy. So as you're looking to prepare now, try to prepare your plan to be ready to go quickly. Because if you can open quickly when the doors open, and we can't predict that yet, you will get more access to media. You'll get more access to audience to attract people without having to spend as much marketing dollars. But in closing, I think more importantly, we're really looking forward to working, myself, Louis, and Sean, and all of our partners on working with our industry partners to help recover and reboot live entertainment. And we look forward to updating you in future calls. Thank you. pass it back to Pat, or where does it go now?
To David.
Hi guys. Thank you. There we go. So I'm just going to be going into a little more detail on some of the pieces that Pat spoke about earlier. So I'm going to try and spend my time to provide a bit of a context of how the system works in responding to COVID-19, the city's economic development and culture, so EDC's response to reopening the cultural sector, and the responsibilities of the cultural sector for reopening. So as you know, the province has declared a state of emergency under the Emergency Management and Civil Protections Act on March 17th, and it's been, as of today, extended until July 15th. So under this order, it's meant to ensure that levels of government have the necessary tools to safely and gradually reopen the province while continuing support for frontline healthcare workers and protect the public from COVID-19. While under this emergency order, the Chief Medical Officer of Health and the province have outlined a gradual, staged approach for reopening the province, restarting the economy, and easing the restrictions put in place to stop the spread of COVID-19. So it's been outlined into 3 phases. So phase 1 being protect and support, where we've seen the provincial government put these emergency orders into place. Phase 2, our current phase, restart, where the province has been taking a 3-staged approach to loosening the emergency measures put in place by the emergency order and try to reopen Ontario. I know that it can be a bit confusing with phases versus stages, so I'll try to keep it clear. And then the 3rd phase, which is the recovery phase, which is to be determined, but the idea is that we'll start to make the transition to living in this quote unquote new normal. So as a part of phase 2, restart, the province has announced that they'd be taking a regional approach to easing restrictions in communities that they deem safe to do so. This past Monday, we saw that they would announce that Toronto would be moving on to stage 2 of reopening. Now that Toronto is entering stage 2, we're seeing, or we will be seeing, public health restrictions loosening that allow for more businesses, services, community spaces, recreational spaces, and outdoor spaces to reopen, and larger public gatherings of up to 10 people being permitted. Since the city's role is more so to enforce these policies set in place by the province, EDC has been working with Toronto Public Health to support and guide the cultural sector during the phases of reopening. So EDC has dedicated staff, aka me, to be able to provide guidance and recommendations to support our cultural sector clients, such as yourselves, in your reopening efforts. So in doing so, we hope that we can ensure that the guidance is grounded in public health evidence, and it also adheres to the current public health directives. So some of the examples of the guidance that we would be providing could look like workplace sanitation, physical distancing, modifying the workspace, and so many other things. But it's important to note that as per the province, the responsibility of reopening is mostly on the individual. So all of you on the phone, you're ultimately responsible for understanding the orders, the regulations in place, and the guidance documents that are presented, and ensuring that you adhere to them to keep you, your employees, and your clients safe. So while we at the city can provide guidance and recommendations to help reopen safely, ultimately that responsibility lies on you. As Pat mentioned, unfortunately, there is no official reopening office at either the provincial or the municipal level in which you can submit plans and receive some type of official stamp of approval indicating that you're ready to reopen. Instead, what you'll find on the province and the city's websites are sector-specific health and safety documents that can help you prepare for reopening. And as of yesterday, Toronto Public Health has issued a guidance document for the cultural and heritage institutions and attractions, which might be of benefit to you when it comes to reopening efforts. And I'll post the link for that in the chat once I'm finished. So for those of you who are unsure if you can reopen or how to do so, we created this visual decision tree to aid you in the process. So in going through it, if you start at the top left corner, you can see that it gives you a review at the provincial level. So according to the provincial framework, does my business fall under the sectors able to reopen in stage 2 of the province reopening? So yes, it does. Then I can move on to the next stage in the decision tree. If not, then you're stuck at that red box, remain closed at the moment. So then moving on to the next stage, here we have all the resources that indicate the requirements set out by the province that need to be in place in order for you to reopen during the current COVID-19 pandemic. So here you're asked to review those links. Again, at current, does my business meet these requirements? No, then you need to read the document, make the necessary changes to ensure that you're compliant. If you can't make the necessary changes, then you have to remain closed at this moment. So once you've reviewed the documents and you've made the necessary changes for compliance, then you can move on to the next stage. So at this third box, now you're reviewing the resources from Toronto Public Health. And then we go through the same process again. Okay, so at current, does my business meet these requirements? No, then you need to make the necessary changes to ensure that you're compliant. If you can't make the necessary changes, then remain closed. If you've reviewed the requirements and made the necessary changes for compliance, then you can move on to the next stage of the decision tree. And you've made it to the final box. So in completing the previous stages, you know that your business has been compliant at both the provincial and municipal level, and you're now able to reopen safely if you choose to do so. And if at any point you have any questions or you need clarification, you can always reach out to me. And then with Toronto Public Health's assistance, we'll be able to provide additional guidance and recommendations. So we are fully aware that when it comes to reopening within the cultural sector, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. And we understand that there will be very detailed and specific questions from several of you. But this decision tree is a great start to move the ball forward on your reopening efforts. And then once you do hit those hiccups, then reach out to myself and TPH, and then we can provide assistance from that point. So one last piece when it comes to this decision tree. So if you find yourself at that red remain closed box, then always feel free to reach out and we can have a discussion as to why you're there. It might just be as simple as you have to wait until Toronto reaches stage 3, that's the West Indian me tree, stage 3 of the provincial reopening, and additional guidance would be available. So in stage 3, we'll see that reopening of larger public gathering venues such as concert halls and sporting events will be opened up, but with greater restrictions in place. And there's more details to come with that. We have to wait until we reach stage 3 and for the province to provide additional guidance. But if this town hall proves to be beneficial, then it would make sense to host an additional one once we've reached stage 3. Lastly, I'd like to add that the city in the past couple of weeks has launched a brief culture reopening and recovery survey that some of you may have seen in the city's Culture TO newsletter. And the purpose of that survey is really to just ask you what you need from the city. So how can the city best support you during these reopening phases? And once we have those results, we'll be sharing them with the folks at TPH and partners like Kris with Lights On to be able to inform some of that work and better support our cultural sector clients during this time. And that survey is live until July the 6th, and I will also post that link in the chat function. So I think I'm reaching my time, but hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. I'll also put my email in the chat function. Thank you.
Thanks, David and Kevin. If I could just jump in briefly for a second, a couple of things to add. So I'm sorry for the tough love messages up front, but we are here to help. We are so lucky to have David Absalom and the partnership with Kris at Ryerson and the Toronto Arts Foundation for that. A couple other things to note. We've been working through this sector by sector and subsector by subsector. So we've worked, for example, to develop an issue, specific supplementary direction to farmers markets. We just did so for drive-in entertainment attractions. So as soon as we think the province is opening up something and we communicate with them a lot, we begin working on it we talk to you, we produce a document, we give it to Toronto Public Health, they vet it, and then we get it out to you as quickly as we can. As David said, there will be no one size fits all, and there's a finite ability for us to respond to every specific instance. But where possible, it'll be that festivals, be that performing arts venues, live music venues, we are going to be working on such guidance and make that available to you as much as we can. And perhaps just, Kevin, before we go to questions, I did want to check in with our experts from the province and Toronto Public Health to see if there's anything that they wanted to state at this point before we throw it open to the Q&A. But Tara, perhaps starting with you.
Hi there. I think that was really great, a really great summary of the very complicated process and responsibilities and roles of public health folks, both at the province and locally, because it is very complicated, and we're trying to do our best at Toronto Public Health to provide the guidance in a little bit more clear language. Some of the provincial orders they're complicated to read, and we understand that. So our guidance is to take the provincial guidance, provide more clear language, and also provide some options on how you can apply those requirements. So happy to answer the questions going forward.
Thanks, Tara. And lastly, Rachel, wondering if we can open up Deborah Larry, John Parsons from the province in case they wanted to chime in.
Can you hear me? It's Deborah here.
Deborah, we can.
Hi all, it's so weird. I can see you all, you can't see me. I'm waving. I'll just say that, you know, a lot of the provincial material that you're seeing is compiled centrally. It's not through the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism and Culture Industries. It's all at a very high level. We are given an opportunity at various points to provide input.
Deborah, if you can hear us, we've lost your audio. If you perhaps
okay. Yes, no, it all disappeared and now it's come back, and I have a little box on the screen. I'm just going to be brief. I'll say that, you know, we in the ministry, in the culture policy branch in particular, have been able at various points to provide information to the more centralized tables so that they can understand the sector a little better, but we are not in any kind of decision-making capacity. So in fact, I'm here as much as the rest of the participants to learn today of what's going on in Toronto. As has been mentioned, it's different in every part of the province too, so it's very complicated. But we've, for example, been providing information up so that the folks that are putting out these orders understand the complexity of the sector, the differences between exhibiting organizations and performing arts venues and live music in the commercial sector. And that's kind of been our role, is just to provide them with intelligence so that hopefully the orders that they put out reflect the reality of the sector on the ground.
Great. Thanks, Deborah. And the last point I'll make is just an encouragement, as David Absalom said, for people to familiarize themselves with all the links that you have in the document. The period from lockdown to phase 1 into phase 2 was long and slow. It will accelerate hereafter. The interval between phase 2 and phase 3 will be much shorter than phase 1 and phase 2. So it'll be useful for people to begin to familiarize themselves. I think, as Kris said, there's a lot of guidance out there in sort of adjacent sectors that is applicable to the cultural sector that'll be worth familiarizing yourself with, communicating with us so we can represent your interest and we can get you timely and clear information as much as possible. But without guessing when it'll be, things I think will start opening up a little more quickly as we head into summer. That's it for me, Kevin.
All right, thank you, Patrick. Thank you, David, Kris, Jacoba, Pat, Claire, and also David Kalinda. We're turning it over to you, the participants who had questions. And basically, I'll be reading the questions, and I'll basically be sending the questions to one responder, and then the others will be open for also responses as well, who are part of the panelists. We received many very thoughtful questions from those who registered, a number of which were duplicated. We've grouped them into 8 separate topics and will do our best to get through them all. We've ordered these to start with the most popular subject areas. In addition, you will have more questions. Please enter them into the chat. If we have time, we'll move on to those. If not, we will incorporate the answers into the transcript which will be released in the next few days. The first question. The most asked question was about the requirement for performing arts sector specific guidelines. Alexia from Culture Center asks, are there standard health and safety guidelines for art spaces planning to reopen? And Jessica Rung actually specifically if public health will be providing guidelines for the performing arts as they have for other sectors. David, would you like to start with this?
Sure. So currently at this time, Ontario hasn't developed any guidance for art spaces to reopen specifically. The City of Toronto has a document that's in the link thanks to the Arts Council for cultural and heritage attractions, and that might be of use to some folks, but there isn't a standard guidance for art spaces right at this moment. However, you would be able to find online some guidelines regarding physical distancing, mask use, cleaning and disinfecting and screening, which would be standard public health guidelines that are applicable to all sectors. And those can also be found on the City of Toronto's website. So that's a great starting point. And when the province does permit reopening, then folks at TPH would essentially think about whether or not it's necessary to develop additional guidance if needed.
Great, thank you. The next one will be for you as well. So get a sip of water.
Well, David tips from the biggest jug in the world. I'm going to just identify one resource. The Event Safety Alliance has an absolutely excellent reopening guide. And maybe Rachel, we can throw that URL up as well for the Event Safety Alliance reopening guide. Thanks.
Thanks, Pat. The second most asked question was about timing, as Pat has also been discussing. Some in the audience are hoping to open their venues this fall. Sandra from Toronto City Opera asked, is it too early to plan for in-person rehearsal sessions in September and live concert in late October? David, we'll start with you again.
So unfortunately, that's something that we don't have any control over. This all falls under that emergency order piece from the province. So we can't really predict or estimate when things will be able to reopen or when you can start rehearsals or have large gatherings, just because we have to wait from the province to have that discussion of when things are going to be reopening. So sorry.
Thank you. Next question is from Matt Farrell from TO Live. Had a few detailed questions that may apply to many in our audience today. First, will it be possible to reduce physical distancing requirements for those venues able to incorporate risk mitigation strategies such as plexiglass barriers between audience seats, enhanced disinfection, etc.? Kris, would you like to start with this one?
Thanks. Matt, it's an awesome question. I'd like to say anything is possible, but it's not. You know, I think physical distancing reductions will allow you to increase your capacities. But I don't think Ontario is going to be the first mover in this space. I think if you want to get guidance, you're probably going to follow, like Britain just reduced it, Quebec's gone to 1.5, follow those other places, just see what they're doing. And we'll see what public health learns when those different regions of the world start to do it. That said, venues should be looking to exceed the basic requirements for disinfection and other standards now and plan to exceed them so that when and if they allow for such things like plexiglass, that you're ready to go.
I would just like to add to that, if it's all right, Kevin. We recognize that the majority of the Tapa membership and cultural industries are not for profit, and that you're working with very limited budgets. even at the best of times before the pandemic, there's not a lot of wiggle room in those budgets. And we know that the PPE, requirements that we're not clear of, you're hearing that there's answers that we're not able to provide because it hasn't yet been dictated by the province, and it varies across the province from city to city to city, as Pat Tobin explained. However, we are acutely aware at Tapa of the limited financial resources to be compliant with those PPE rules and regulations that are going to be dictated when they come, whenever they come, and whatever they are. Being able to afford it is going to be critical. So one of the things that we are looking at for you at Tapa is investigating bulk buying and discount access to PPE to make sure that no one is left out, that everyone's under the tent, that everyone has access to the training, that everyone, which will happen through Kris Gibbs's Lights On, that everyone has access to not only the training through Lights On, but also to the equipment to make sure that you're compliant. This has to be equitable, and it's the only way that we're going to regain the public's confidence, so that if you're going to venue A, you're experiencing the exact same thing in venue B. So I just wanted to echo that we know that this is a huge concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Kris, and thank you, Jacoba. The next question, Matt's second question, is about testing. And it is, there are many areas within the performance arts sector, including acting on stage, where PPE and physical distancing is not possible. Will Toronto Public Health and EDC champion free and frequent access to COVID-19 testing for our industry? Pat, can you start with this one?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Tara from Toronto Public Health will chime in a moment. Testing is free for everyone in Ontario, and as the regime has gotten better, it's moved from risk-based analysis around entrance into the country, those working in high-risk settings, the elderly, et cetera, to now publicly accessible. So if you have symptoms, you should get checked, absolutely. In terms of testing your employees, as Kris noted in his response earlier, there are settings such as hospitals, many essential worker settings, where testing or at least screening with temperature checks and other measures is necessary, applicable, and in points affordable. So we'll work, tying back now to Jacoba's question, I think as we saw with the pipeline issues, the supply chain issues around PPE, to the extent possible, it's going to be really important that we work collaboratively to address that for that technology, which is going to be important on reopening, both to manage the health of the public, the health of your employees, but also, as Jacoba's pointing out, to ensure that arts patrons, consumers broadly, have a high level of confidence returning to performing arts venues. Luckily, there are some technologies that appear to have the potential to be world leading that are being developed in Ontario. So perhaps we're not dealing with the globalized supply chain issues we dealt with on PPE. And Jacoba's idea of consolidated buys is really important. The city will work with that, working with some of the big organizations that need to buy lots and lots. I think we need to open up those orders. I think we're also thinking about this from a venue perspective. Everything we're talking about here is very expensive to apply. So certainly outdoor performance will precede indoor. So the ability to find outdoor performance sites that we can build the infrastructure and then spread those costs over a large number of presenters, that will be critical. We're doing that right now on drive-ins, trying to figure that piece out. And we hope to apply that same thinking as we get closer in stage 3, 4 to how that would work. And I'll just turn Kevin to Tara to see if she wants to.
So I'll focus a bit more on the testing part of that question. As Pat mentioned, testing is currently free in Ontario, and Everyone who has symptoms, even if it's just one symptom, you're encouraged to get tested right now. Now, as it was mentioned earlier, testing is the jurisdiction of the province. It's not the municipality's jurisdiction. So in terms of this ongoing free testing moving forward, when we move to stage 3, I can't comment on that. However, it does mean that screening for symptoms will be very important. So currently, Toronto Public Health recommends that all organizations, owners, operators are actively screening all of their staff. So actively means you're actually asking the questions of the screening checklists, which the City of Toronto has checklists on their website for each staff, performer, whomever who's entering the facility. And we also recommend passive screening for others, such as customers that will be coming to view. I imagine those recommendations will still remain when we move on to stage 3.
Tara, Pat speaking, just a question related in the chat function. How frequently can employers screen their employees?
It's recommended that you screen every single time the employee comes to work. So every shift.
Great, thank you, Pat. Thank you, Tara. We're moving on to another question, and this question was from Jacelyn from Arts in the Park. She asked about permits for outdoor programming. Will there be additional conditions that have to be fulfilled in order to get permits? Will Toronto Public Health have to sign off on permits? Will TPH provide any additional support for events, including being present to ensure the event is proceeding safely? And we'll encourage David as a responder.
I'll take this one, Kevin.
Okay. No problem.
That's David, that works?
Yeah, totally fine.
Okay, the short answer is yes. We have the examples of the farmers markets to apply here. And so I'll use that as an example. The province allowed farmers markets in phase 1 as essential service food security. Toronto, the City of Toronto Public Health Unit, didn't feel we were equipped, given the density of the city, to open them. So we said no, and then we just reopened them 2 weeks ago. And we provided these protocols in hand hygiene, cash management, sanitation, washrooms, et cetera, physical distancing. And so people to get their permit have to read that and give us a safety plan, and then they get the permit. So we are applying additional requirements. It'll probably function a lot like that. The onus will be, as the theme of this call has been, on the proponent to do the homework and get ready for that. But yes, absolutely, there's likely to be supplementary requirements. And for Arts in the Park, talking to your friendly neighborhood farmers market will be a great way to understand how it functions.
Thank you, Pat. David, this other one will be for you. And it says here, a number of you want to know about additional risk associated with specific art forms. Carol Kehoe from Telephone Music asked if there is any further information available about risks associated with signing in public, and if guidelines need to be different for singers. Similar questions from those working with wind instruments and dancers have been asked.
So yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's an ever-evolving question. So what we know right now is that COVID-19 is a respiratory infection, and it spreads mainly from person to person through close contact from respiratory droplets. It's droplets of someone that has COVID-19. So, and these droplets can travel as far as 2 meters when we cough, sneeze, talk, or yell. So with the current evidence out there, some guidance has suggested that the droplets can be emitted from from distances pretty far and from activities such as singing and playing wind instruments, and that could potentially make them at a higher risk. However, there is a lack of evidence on the exact distance of how far you should have artists maintain between each other or performers between each other, and it's also difficult to try and use mask while playing the flute. So because of that, a lot of the guidance so far has been all about eliminating the exposure altogether. So having no singing or restricting singing, restricting wind instruments. And again, with dancers, it's a similar issue just because of that close contact. And right now, with the current level of evidence out there, there hasn't really been any type of guidance being put out there besides eliminating the exposure. When new evidence does come out, like those things can potentially change, but at the moment, there's not much available for those activities.
Thank you, David. I want to note time that it's 2:30, and for anyone else who's out there participating, we have only 2 questions left. So if you can stay with us for the next 2 questions, it would be ideally amazing. Thank you, David, for that response. I'll move to the next question. There were, of course, as well, a number of questions about funding. Will the government assist with the cost of PPE for both performers and audience members, as well as other costs associated with reopening? Pat or Claire, would you like to speak to this?
We were waiting each other out.
I know.
I think, thanks, Kevin, for the question. I think it's gonna be difficult to pay our way out of any component of this crisis. The we here is the city. And I don't need to go into the details of that. However, we recognize that this is critical, and we've spent a bit of time on this call thus far talking about how we control costs. I think that's going to be the first thing we need to do, is avoid small late orders at the peak of a buying cycle. So how we can figure that out means, as Kris Gibbs said, watch some of the first movers like Starbucks that are breaking ground. Starbucks is actively prototyping a bunch of stuff that might have broad industry application. If that emerges, and if it's not a proprietary relationship, then the city can and should get involved. We are not the quickest procurement organization in the world, so working through third parties would probably be the best route. And I don't want to overpromise on this because this moves fast, it's complicated, and it'll be a seller's market, right? It's going to be looking back at PPE. So I think what we're going to do, liquidity is the crisis underneath the public health crisis, right? So we bear that in mind, that we need to ensure that organizations stay solvent. They can make sound business decisions. Kris's points about being able to think about when it is actually a paying proposition to reopen is really, really important. And layering over those new costs, difficult as they are to predict right now, is a really important component of business planning. We'll figure out a way to help, but I don't see us having a massive grant program to offset, for example, the costs of PPE.
Thank you, Pat. And our last question is actually directed to you again. Finally, there was a request for a central information clearinghouse of all requirements associated with arts programming in the time of COVID-19. This should include up-to-date information on public health requirements for performing arts organizations, but also for the many additional venues and kinds of programming engaged in by arts organizations, such as summer camps, parks, libraries, community centers, etc. Pat, do you have anything that you'd like to, again, talk about is being planned for this?
Yeah, absolutely. Communication is going to be key. As noted, this is already complex and confusing, and it will accelerate on us. So as David said, if folks find this useful, we should do more of this, as well as communicate through other channels. The Toronto Arts Council has been great about pushing out its updates with this type of information. EDC has recently launched a Culture TO bulletin, and we'll push this information out through that too. David's email address is identified on that one-page schematic. So people will be using David until such time as it proves overwhelming to be a point of contact to collect your questions and answer them. And hopefully through all those channels, we get you the information in a clear and timely way.
Thank you, Pat. And we want to acknowledge that there were so many other questions that came up in the chat, but sadly, we don't really have the time to address them here. They will be addressed, as mentioned at the top, by the panelists and the organizers. So at this point, I want to say thank you for all the questions that were asked, and also want to throw it over to Claire for closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for handling the questions. And I just wanted to say there are more questions in the chat room. We will endeavor to answer them. And if we can't answer them this time, we will be rescheduling or scheduling another session in the future as things become clearer. We know this is a very trying time for everyone, and things are complex, so that we will do our very best to make it as clear as we possibly can, but still the answers are not necessarily there at all levels at the moment. But I'd like to thank so much Pat and David and Kris and Tara and Deborah and John for your help today, and again to Kevin. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Thanks again. Goodbye.